We planned a John Muir Trail hike without ever doing a single hike together.
Going back to 2016, a friend of mine who I'd met at work and I had enjoyed talking about hiking and watching videos of folks who were hiking on the PCT. We would regularly get coffee together. I actually had a back surgery in 2021. So in one of our conversations, he was telling me his plan to go hike the John Muir Trail. It had been about a year since I had surgery, and so it seemed like a good goal to go hike the John Muir Trail. Mark and I were both avid hikers. As far as the trip, we were able to plan, but Mark and I had never hiked together. So this was going to be the first hike that we ever did with each other. It seemed a little odd. We did attempt to go on a hike together, but we just never found the time to do that.
Mark was 61, and this was his retirement hike. For me, it was a back from surgery hike.
So before we ever stepped onto the trail, there was one thing we already didn't know.
The trail started high, the packs were heavy, and we were about to find out if those coffee discussions meant anything.
We made our way to Lone Pine from Sacramento, met in Yosemite, where Mark and I had parked. My dad then drove us down to Lone Pine. We spent a night in the Dow Villa. The next day, we were up at Horseshoe Meadows and worked our way to New Army Pass.
To get the permits for the John Muir Trail, we decided to enter in below Mount Whitney at either Cottonwood or New Army. We got our permits for New Army Pass, which added about 30 miles to the trip. The additional miles mean additional days. We are going to have about 9 days on the trail before we get to Muir Trail Ranch. That's going to be where we're going to do our first resupply. So with the backpacks packed for 9 days, my backpack was weighing somewhere around 45 to 50 pounds at the start. Most of that was food. My base weight was under 20 pounds.
The John Muir Trail either starts or ends at Whitney, and for us it was going to be starting at the top of Mount Whitney. But we had to get there, and so this was one of the easiest ways for us to get in there, to get a permit to go hike the John Muir Trail. So we planned to hike the John Muir Trail without ever hiking together. That first day, pulling short of our original goal, we were supposed to be going to Rock Creek, but there's a campsite that's maybe a mile or two before Rock Creek campsite. We stayed there. It was a tough first day. I was happy that the day came to an end. When it did, the end of the trail seemed very far away.
One of the things Mark and I discussed was what time do we want to get up in the morning? Mark was an early riser and I was a fan of sleeping in. The compromise time was 7 a.m. We would get up at 7, although we were not necessarily in a rush to get walking right at 7. It would typically take us about 2 hours to go through our morning routine before we started hiking. 9 a.m. started to be referred to as our standard hiking time.
So the next day, we wake up and we leave our beautiful site. Even though the day had some elevation gain, it was really supposed to be a mellow day, but it wasn't. By the time Mark and I were rolling into Crabtree Meadows, I was so beat and exhausted from the day. Once we were on the trail, the schedule stopped seeming less like a plan and more just like a suggestion. At the end of that day, we just say, Mark, when we go to Muir Trail Ranch, we have to stay there for 2 days. As we were planning on staying there for 1 day. I just thought, I need to be looking forward to something a little bit more than that. I need a 0 day. So Mark agreed. I wasn't really even thinking about Yosemite at that point. I was just thinking about Muir Trail Ranch. Whitney was only the beginning of the trail, not the reward for getting through it. It wasn't until the third day that we hiked Mount Whitney. The weather that day was gorgeous, maybe 5-mile-an-hour winds. Mark and I walked up Mount Whitney. took our pictures, and we began the trail. Everything was going pretty well, except for I really wasn't eating very much. My food, it was good. I just wasn't that hungry for it. And things like bars just were not tasting good at all. Day 4, you have to go over, Forester Pass. And that's the 13,000 foot pass, tallest pass on the PCT, I believe. And so we got, by the time we got to the bottom of that, I was pretty beat. More of the same on day 5. I was dragging pretty hard. But by the time I got to day 5, I had started eating a little bit more. The beef stroganoff was tasting particularly good. And, Mark and I were able to keep going. He seemed pretty strong through all that time. I'm not sure if the elevation was impacting him as much as it did me. So going northbound, it's kind of rough because you do start so high up in elevation. I mean, New Army Pass is 12,000 feet. Obviously Mount Whitney, 14,000, and Forester, 13,000. And then you're in the land of 12,000 foot passes, all the way until you're gonna get to Muir Trail Ranch. The elevation was kind of impacting me mainly in, what I was eating, which was starting to impact how much strength I had. But at some point through the high Sierras, I started eating and I got my strength. "2023 was a big year for rain and snow. The bridge that going across the Middle Fork of the San Joaquin River had collapsed. And well, it had received some severe damage, and then it might as well have collapsed. Some people did still go across it, but for the most part, it wasn't advised. A lot of people were going around it. There was a variety of alternate routes. At this point, the water had gotten low enough where people were starting to ford the river, which was great, and that was the plan. And on the morning of our 9th day, we woke up just outside of Evolution River, where we had to cross that before the Middle Fork of the San Joaquin, before a 4-mile stretch we'll cross another river, which will finally have a bridge before we're maybe a mile or 2 from Muir Trail Ranch, where we plan to check in for 2 nights. It had been thunderstormy and rainy a couple days leading up to that point, which is fine. The first 7 days or so on the trail were totally sunny, so I figured, we had to pay our dues. In the morning of day 9, I was so excited to go to Muir Trail Ranch. I just packed everything up quickly, and I had the tent on the outside of my backpack. And at some point, my backpack, something was, loose and wiggling around, and Mark came up and he adjusted my backpack for me, which was appreciated. And we crossed Evolution Creek, and, we started working our way toward the Middle Fork of the San Joaquin. And this was sort of the climax of the trip, as this had been the river that everybody had been talking about. One thing I didn't consider at the time was that even though folks had started fording the river, it had just rained like 2 days. The river was probably a little higher than maybe it was when people were fording it. I didn't think about that at the time. All I could think about was Muir Trail Ranch. So we get to the river, and Mark and I have to cross this really wide, really raging river. There is a spot that folks have talked about, and it says when you get to the broken bridge, there's a camp there of workers who are fixing the bridge. Well, they're replacing the bridge. Just downstream of that camp, you can cross the river. My buddy Mark's actually a stormwater engineer. So I'm leaving all the planning of the water crossing up to him. Mark picks the spot. Up to this point, Mark actually hadn't been hiking with poles. So Mark grabs 2 sticks, and he's, leading the way. And we start crossing the Middle Fork at the San Joaquin. And the water's going about waist high. I think it's just a little below my waist, personally, as we're going across. I'm 5'10". And, Mark gets to a spot where the water actually goes up a little bit over his waist. And I'm like, oh, maybe I'll go a slightly different way, right? So I go a slightly different way. It was a better way. Inches mattered in that moment. Once we got across the river, it felt like we could relax a little. That didn't last long. 4 miles past that spot, we get to another bridge crossing. We put our packs down, But I'm looking at my pack and I think, that didn't look right. And so I go up to my pack and I realize that I don't have my tent. At some point in all this, 2 river crossings, probably 7 miles, with not just like an easy river crossing, but the climax of the trip. And I'm realizing there's a good chance my tent is back somewhere in between where Mark adjusted my backpack and where we slept. If I go, I could be there, camp there that night, and then I could be back at Muir Trail Ranch again the next day. Or I can just let it go. I did feel bad about littering in the woods, but there is a ranger station very close to where that tent was lost. It was unfortunate. So I was tent free at that point. And I was thinking about Muir Trail Ranch.
In the arms of the angel.
Once I realized I lost my tent and didn't have time to go back and get it, the miles between us and Mammoth started to look a lot different. The trail never stayed settled for very long. So we made it to Muir Trail Ranch. Mark had made reservations for 1 night, which is great. We were able to extend it to 2. And there's hot springs in Muir Trail Ranch that are really nice, and you should go. And then there's hot springs outside of Muir Trail Ranch, and I've heard stories about them, but I've not checked it out. I should go. And the food's delicious, and the people are amazing. So it was a great time. That was my first time there. It really recharged the batteries, and it was a game changer. Something about getting to MTR made the whole trip a lot less overwhelming. From there, we needed to get to Mammoth, and I was feeling optimistic. Although we did just experience some thunderstorms, and I didn't have a tent. I had a plan. We had the internet. So we checked the weather, and it seemed like we were going to be fine. Seemed like the weather was going to be okay. And so after 2 days, we left and we went to Mammoth. Just outside of Mammoth, there's a lake called Duck Lake that we were hiking to. We got there as planned. It was about a 16-mile hike that day to get from point A to point B. It's full of clouds. It's a bit of a valley, and so it's got all this clouds trapped in there, and it's raining. It's been actually a beautiful day, and I get to my destination and it's raining. The plan was for Mark and I, if needed, to share his tent. He had a 2-person tent, and we could have done that. At the same time, Mark and I had all of our gear on. Mammoth was about 10 miles away. And so we did the math and thought, if we hike right now, we can be in Mammoth, get an Uber, get a hotel, get a drink. And I thought, that's a great idea. So we did hike the 10 miles, but we ended up at this lake called Horseshoe Lake. And at Horseshoe Lake, we tried to get an Uber. I tried for about 30 minutes. But apparently there's no Uber in Mammoth. And there might be now, but in 2023, no Uber. Mark and I ended up just needing to camp at Horseshoe Lake. We woke up in the morning and realized that you actually probably shouldn't camp at Horseshoe Lake, as it can release some toxic gases and you could potentially die. We're in a good spot if you wanted to catch transit. Mammoth has phenomenal transit, and there is a transit spot right there. But it was like 6 a.m. or whatever. We got this toxic lake next to us. Transit wasn't starting for a while, and I was hungry. And I think town was about 3 miles in, right? So I thought, well, that's all right. That's an hour or so, plus it's roads, and it's downhill. So we quickly lose the internet and our navigation, and we end up going on the wrong road. But fortunately, I was hitchhiking as we were walking, and a local did stop and pick us up. I was so happy we had showers in Muir Trail Ranch, and we did wash our clothes. And we're in Mammoth eating breakfast. Everything's going pretty good, except for now Mark his shin is starting to hurt him, which isn't very good. So we took it easy in Mammoth. We didn't spend a lot of time walking around. We got our room at the Shiloh. We got our breakfast, we got our lunch, and I stopped by, I think it's like Mammoth Outfitters, and I got my new tent. So for the rest of the day, we rested Mark got a compression sleeve for his leg. He wasn't even sure that he was going to be finishing the hike. There was talk of maybe we just, call it a day. The next day we were back on the trail. We took that phenomenal Mammoth free transit back out to the trail, and we started heading toward Yosemite. After that, the hike stopped seeming about pace and mileage and started seeming about what we could realistically do that day. Yosemite's a few days away. By then, we weren't trying to hike long distances anymore. We were just trying to keep moving and stay close enough to the agenda. Mark pushed through. He was using a lot of that ibuprofen, though. He was hurt. But, we made it through, and we tried to pace ourselves. And to be honest with you, he hid the pain. I barely knew that he was struggling. So the last big pass, there are a couple smaller ones, I think maybe at least one smaller one, but the last big pass on the John Muir Trail as you approach Yosemite is Donahue, which is right there at the border. And once the trail went over Donahue Pass, the finish started taking care of itself. Our confidence grew. Mark was still hiking with pain, but it seemed manageable. And we were settling into a rhythm. Neither of us had to be perfect. We just needed to keep adjusting. That was the real difference by the end. Reaching Yosemite felt good, but also a bit like reaching wilderness land in Disneyland. Not quite as relaxing as hiking through some of those high Sierra valleys, with no easy way in and no easy way out. Somewhere along the way, the trail stopped seeming intimidating and just started seeming like daily life. By the end of the trail, I wasn't thinking about whether I could do something like this anymore. I was already thinking about where I wanted to go next.